Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary from marysnest.com, where I share traditional recipes for making nutrient-dense foods using simple ingredients. And today, I'd like to share with you how I make roast chicken bone broth for pennies a jar. If you're new to my channel, welcome, and if you'd like to learn more about traditional cooking, be sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any videos. Okay, let's get started. First of all, I wanted to let you know that earlier today I roasted a chicken. Now we've eaten the chicken, some of it, and I've saved the leftovers, and I've added the bones to my scrap container here, because I'm going to get ready to make roast chicken bone broth. I've also added water to the pan in which I roasted the chicken to deglaze it and get all of the juices and whatnot that I'll also use in making the bone broth. I grew up eating bone broths. My mother was very thrifty and always saved the bones, whether they were beef bones or chicken bones, lamb bones, whatever the case may be, and she always made bone broth out of it. And when I was a younger woman, I kind of got away from it a bit. And then when I was a new mother, I discovered this book, Nourishing Traditions by Sally Fallon, and got right away back to making bone broths, which is one of the core things in this book that she talks about making. Now, back then, when this book first came out, the recipe for making bone broths talks about leaving it on your stovetop for 24 hours, 48 hours, I think sometimes even as long as 72 hours. And I used to do that. It was very difficult to monitor and maintain the right temperature and whatnot. I was way too worried about leaving the stove on overnight and the fragrance of the broth emanating through the entire house and so on and so forth. So I was thrilled when Sally Fallon, the author of Nourishing Traditions, came out with a more recent book called Nourishing Broth. This is an excellent book. I highly recommend it. And in this book, she talks about how you can make bone broth in the crock pot and that you can make it for as little as 6 or 12 hours. So what I find that I do is I make chicken bone broth for 6 hours and I make beef bone broth for 12 hours. And at 6 hours, I find is the perfect amount of time to get just the right consistency and a nice gelled bone broth, which is what I really like. And the reason that I like it to be very gelled is that that's a good sign that there's a lot of gelatin, obviously, if it's gelled, and collagen in it. And that comes from when some of the skin and the grizzle and on the chicken breaks down because of the acid that you add, which we'll talk about that in a minute, and goes into the broth, and then that nourishes you. It nourishes our joints, our skin, our hair, our nails, everything. It's wonderful. There are also a lot of other nutrients that are in bone broth that are good for you as well. Nourishing the gut, which today everyone's talking about nourishing gut health, so that's always a good thing. Now what I like to do is save my chicken carcass after I roast a chicken or poach a chicken, a whole chicken, whatever I do. But when it comes to making bone broth, I like to have a total of 3 chicken carcass. So what I do is I keep a bag like this in one of these containers, and these are very common. You can find them at the grocery store. I've seen them at my local grocery store and at places like Walmart, Target, you know, very easy to find. They're made by Rubbermaid and they're very inexpensive. I like to line mine with a plastic bag. The only reason I like to do that is, and you don't have to, you could put it right into the container, but as I'm saving up for the 3 chicken carcass, I like to zip it closed and then push all the air out of it to just try and prevent as much freezer burn as I can. It's not a perfect situation. It's not airtight, but it's better than nothing. Once I have 3 carcasses, what I like to do then is make the bone broth. So I'll pull this out, and as you can see, let me get this out of the way. And I also mark on my container, because I use 2, and I'll explain this one in a minute, that it's chicken carcass scraps for bone broth. what I do is, okay, so I've got the 3 chicken carcass in here. I also have any little bits and pieces of scraps, the wing tips, some skin, some fat, different things from the chicken that we didn't eat originally, and any extra meat that I didn't pull off to save for leftovers. So I've got my 3 carcasses here. I've got some chicken wing tips. I've got a chicken neck, bones, just a mixture of things. So I'm going to put that right into my crock pot. What I'm going to do is I've got it plugged in. For now, I'm just going to unplug it so you can see exactly what I'm doing. And this is an 8-quart stock pot, crock pot or slow cooker. It's a nice size for making bone broth. And again, you can find these almost anywhere, and it was very reasonable to purchase. You could also use a 6-quart if that's what you've got. Okay. Now, if you're especially industrious, you could wash this out and save it, but I usually do discard it. I'm just going to put that over there for now. So I've got that in there. The next thing that I'm going to do is add an acid, and the acid helps to break down the little bits of cartilage that will help make the stock or bone broth gelatinous. And you can use various things. A lot of people like to use apple cider vinegar. That's definitely an option. I like to use white vermouth, and the reason is I find that it just imparts a softer flavor as the alcohol cooks off in the bone broth. But you don't have to do that at all. You can certainly use apple cider vinegar. I recommend only about 1/4 cup because the apple cider vinegar can have a little bit of a strong taste that can remain in the bone broth. That's just my personal opinion. Experiment with it. And if I'm using the white vermouth, I'll use 1 cup. Okay, so I have my cup of white vermouth that I'm going to pour over my chicken bones and scraps here. And I hope you can see that. That's everything that's in there so far. Next, what I do is whenever I'm cooking and I'm cutting up different vegetables, it could be carrots, celery, onions, even lettuces, I save all the scraps and I put them again in another Rubbermaid container like this, and I just mark it veggie scraps for bone broth. Now this could be for either a chicken bone broth or beef bone broth, whatever I'm making. And I again do the same thing. I use a plastic bag because I put this in the freezer as well, and I push it down to get as much air out as I can. Now in this bag, it's primarily a lot of onion scraps, onion skins, some celery, and just a few carrots, not much, but I'm going to put all of this in here. Perfect. Okay. Now this bag I'm going to put right back in. It's not too dirty. And a lot of times when I'm cooking, I'll just leave it like this. I'll take it out as if I'm doing something with carrots or celery or onions or whatever, and I'll have that out and put those in to make sure I don't put anything in the garbage. Alrighty. Now, there's a lot of onion scraps in here already, so I'm not going to add another onion. There's not a lot of celery and carrots, and I like some celery and carrots in my bone broth. It imparts a nice flavor. And I had some celery in my refrigerator that was starting to look a little sad. That's perfect for bone broth. These carrots were starting to sort of grow little roots here, whatnot. So I'm going to go ahead and put these in. Oops, sorry. Alrighty. Then, even though there is some seasoning that's left over from roasting the chicken, I still like to add 1 bay leaf and about a teaspoon of peppercorns. But the piece de resistance, so to speak, are the chicken feet. Chicken feet help make the bone broth so gelatinous. And I found these right at my local grocery store, and it's a good amount of feet in here, and it was only $1.68. That's a good buy. I've also found chicken feet at my farmer's market anywhere from $2 a package to $5 a package, depending on how many feet are in the package. Now, granted, I think the chicken feet from the farmer's market are probably a little better quality than the chicken feet from the grocery store. But even so, if I find them at the grocery store for such a bargain price like this, I do get them and I pop them in my freezer, and then I have them when I'm ready to make chicken bone broth. Well, I've opened my package of chicken feet and it had a total of 12 feet. I took out 6, and the reason I'm using 6 chicken feet is because I have the carcasses of 3 chickens. So 6 feet and 3 chickens goes together. Now, these feet are nice and clean. As I said, they came from the grocery store. Now, the ones that I get from the farmer's market are also clean. But if you buy them directly from a farmer who may not have cleaned them, don't worry. They'll have like a yellow coating on them. All you need to do is quickly dip them in boiling water to blanch them, but be quick about it. You don't want to leave them in too long because then the skin will cook, the gelatin will start to come out of it, and it'll also make the yellow skin coating on top very difficult to get off. So you basically just want to blanch them quickly and then peel off that outer yellow coating, and that's it. It's not difficult. Now, the next thing, some people when they make bone broth like to cut off the little claws here. I don't worry about it, but it's personal choice. Whatever you choose to do is fine. Alrighty, so I'm gonna go ahead and put these chicken feet into the slow cooker, and then we'll add the water and we'll be ready to turn it on. Okay, well, I've washed and dried my hands after touching the chicken feet. Now I'm ready to pour in the water. Now, just a note about the water. This is water from my refrigerator that has a filter on it. You can also use bottled water. And if you're just using water from your tap, if you have no filter on your fridge or you don't have access to bottled water, you can boil your water that you take right from the tap and let it cool off, and that'll help dissipate some of the chlorine or chloramines that your local water provider may use to clean the water if you're worried about having that in your bone broth. The other option is you can pour it from your tap and just let it sit overnight, and I think that helps dissolve some of the chlorine or chloramines as well. If any of you know about that, I'd love to hear about it. You could leave it in the comments below. Alrighty. I'm going to go ahead and pour this water in now. Now, this is a good point to discuss some troubleshooting when it comes to making bone broth. A lot of times you can wind up adding too much water. You want to add just enough water to cover. And I think this pitcher, because I've made this a lot, is going to be just about the right amount. And that's perfect. Now, depending on what size crock pot or slow cooker you're using, will determine exactly how much water you add. So you just kind of play that by ear a little. Now I'm going to push this down just a little to show you. See, that's perfect. Everything can more or less be submerged, and that is just the right amount of water. So now we'll get ready to turn it on, but let me just wash my hands again. Alrighty, well, I've just moved my crock pot over to my slow cooker over to the side here so I could plug it in, because my plug is over on the far side of the island. Now, what I like to do is turn this to high, but only for about an hour. And then after an hour, I like to turn it down to keep warm. And the reason I've found is that with this particular slow cooker, if I keep it on high, it's gonna boil for the whole 6 hours. And even if I keep it on low, it's gonna be boiling. And that's the problem when it comes to creating a gelatinous stock. If it boils for too long, it will break, that's the expression that I've heard people use, it breaks the gelatin, and you'll get a watery gelatin instead of one that's nice and gelatinous. Now, it will still have nutrients in it and it'll still be good for you, but you'll lose that, the benefits of the gelatin. Now, bone broth is best made at about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And on my particular slow cooker, if I put in a thermometer to test the temperature when it's fully up to temp for the keep warm setting, it's at 180. And I have found this is perfect for making a nice bone broth that's gelatinous. And this particular bone broth is very flavorful because I made it from a roast chicken. You can certainly do this with the scraps left over from a raw chicken that maybe you've cut up and are roasting in your oven in individual pieces or putting on the grill or something like that. And you have the neck and maybe the wing tips and things like that left over that you've accumulated over time. And you can certainly make bone broth with a whole chicken. Sometimes I've made a recipe where it's a combination of sort of poaching and braising a chicken on the stove. And the broth that I'll get from that after when I go to take the leftovers out of the refrigerator is very gelatinous. So that's always an option too. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back on high. I'm going to watch this for an hour, and then I'm going to come back after an hour and turn this down to warm. Now, while I'm waiting for this to come up to a simmer on the high setting, I just wanted to share a few more things with you if you do this on your stovetop. If you have a stock pot and you put all your ingredients in and you're bringing it up to temp, you want to bring it up just below a rolling boil. It'll start to, show some simmering and bubbles popping and whatnot. Immediately turn it down to low. If you have an electric stove like I do, remove it to a different burner and then bring it back to the original burner once you've got that cooled down to a low temperature. If you have a gas cooktop, you don't have to worry about this. It's nice it makes it nice and easy to adjust. But the reason that I want to share this is if you let that boil too long, as I had mentioned earlier, which is the problem that you can have with a slow cooker, is that again it'll break the gelatin. So that's just a little tip that I want to share with you if you are doing it on your stovetop. Just sort of bring it up to a boil, not a real fast rolling, just right way when it comes up to a boil, and then turn it down to low, move it off the burner, put it back once it's cooled down, and then let it simmer for 6 to 12 hours on a low setting. You may even need to use one of those little cast iron heat diffusers that it's just looks like a flat little cast iron. I'll look for one online and link to it below in case you need that. A little cast iron diffuser that you'll put on your electric cooktop, and it'll help diffuse some of the heat if your low setting just isn't low enough. Because all you want to see when you do it on the stovetop or in the crock pot is just an occasional bubble, like bloop, bloop, like that. And then you know you've got it at the right temp. And then you can also always use a thermometer to test it, a cooking thermometer, to test exactly what temperature you've got it at about. And as I said, you really want to try for 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Alrighty, well, I've had this simmering on the keep warm setting for about 6 hours now. Took about an hour to get it up to the 180 degrees Fahrenheit that I wanted on the high setting. And once that happened, I turned it right down to keep warm and let it simmer at that keep warm setting for the 6 hours. And now I'm ready to strain. Well, what I wanted to mention to you before I start straining this is that I did add in the drippings from the roasting pan where I had roasted a chicken earlier in the day, and I did add that into this. I didn't show you that, but I just wanted to let you know I did add in those drippings, which help give it a really nice, help give the bone broth a nice, rich color. Also, too, one thing I want to mention at this point is that I do not add garlic to my chicken bone broth. And the reason is, if I want a garlic flavor in my bone broth, I add it in after the fact when I'm making a soup or just drinking it as a plain broth, whatever the case may be, making a gravy, whatever. The reason is, I find that when I put garlic in bone broth and it simmers for 6 or longer hours, to me, it just gets a little bit of an off flavor. So I avoid it and I add it in later if I want. But again, it's personal choice. Experiment, see how you feel it, how it happens with garlic if you add it in and if you like the taste, if not. And I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts are on that. So leave me something down in the comments telling me what your thoughts are about adding garlic to bone broth or not. Now, I like to strain my bone broth using this wire strainer that I bought at an Asian grocery store. It's wonderful. I paid about $3.99 for it. So definitely look for this if you're out and about shopping. Now, talking about straining the stock, or the bone broth, excuse me, some people will save everything that we're going to strain out and make a second batch of bone broth. And I often do that, and I probably will with these remains, especially since you're only simmering it for 6 hours. There's probably still quite a bit of more nutrition, especially in the feet, that you might be able to extract. So what I'm going to do is I put the crock pot in a bowl over a towel. It's a little bit of a mess. And I'm going to put this in a bowl, and I'm going to set this aside and save it for a second batch. So I'm going to continue to strain all of this out and let as much of the broth drip out as I can, and then just continue to transfer this into a bowl, which, as I said, we'll set aside and save to make another batch of bone broth. And I'm just going to continue doing this until I get all the bits and pieces out, and then we'll get ready to strain whatever little bits of debris may be left before we decant it. Well, I've strained out everything and I've got it in this bowl. Before I put this to the side, I just wanted to show you one of the feet. As you can see, it's a little hot, but as you can see, it still has quite a bit of structure to it. So I definitely think that I can get another batch of bone broth out of this that will be gelatinous. Now, the second batch will be lighter because it won't have the drippings from the roast chicken pan, and it'll just be lighter by the nature of that there is less to come out of these bones and vegetables and feet. But I do feel there is still some nutrition that we can extract from the chicken feet. So I'll basically repeat the process like I did the first time. I'll add this back into the slow cooker once I take the broth out. I'll add the white vermouth, I'll add the water, maybe another bay leaf, some peppercorns, maybe a few aromatics, it depends. And I'll do the same thing, bring it up to temp, and let it slow cook for 6 hours, and then strain it. And hopefully that'll be a nice gelatinous second batch of bone broth. Now, something I want you to note is that in this bone broth, even though we've strained out all of the vegetables and chicken bits and whatnot, there are still little bits and pieces of some of its vegetable, some of its little bits of debris from that's left over, that's come off the different chicken parts. So it's not quite clear enough yet to decant. So we're going to want to strain it. Now, I take one step in this process that requires a little bit of a special piece of equipment, and that's a fat separator. I used to just use this little one, and it's not as streamlined as this one or as big. But what I would do is I'd put the bone broth in here, and the fat would come to the top, and then I would just pour off as much of the broth as I saw coming off until I saw that the fat was down here. Then I would stop pouring, and I would empty out the fat into another container, which we'll talk about the fat in a bit, and then keep doing that process. Then I discovered this wonderful gadget. I think it was relatively inexpensive. I think I ordered it online from maybe Williams-Sonoma or Solotab, one of those kitchen stores, I'm not sure. I'll have to check, and I'll look for a link and leave that below. But this is wonderful because as I put the bone broth in, and you'll see, the fat will rise to the top here. We'll have all the bone broth underneath. But what's so great about this gadget is it has a little handle here that you open up, and then the broth comes out the bottom. And then when I see the fat right about there, then I stop. Okay, but just putting it through this top strainer here, as you see, it's got very large holes. This does not catch enough of the debris that I want to remove from the bone broth. So what I do is I have a large measuring cup here. You can use a bowl, you can use a pot, anything that you have. Then I take a fine mesh strainer, I put that over it, and then I line the strainer with a flour sack cloth. I love these. Now, I have had these probably for 20 years. They have just held up great. And I purchased them in a package of, I think, 12 or 20, I can't remember, so many years ago, at I believe it was a Sam's Club or a Costco, and both of them still carry them to this day. I've seen them in their kitchen area. What I like about this is it catches all the debris that I want to catch, and then I just wash it off in my sink, and then I wash it in my washing machine, along with my other dish towels. Now, a lot of people like to use cheesecloth. The only problem I have with cheesecloth is it's a little expensive, at least it's become a little expensive now. But some people I've heard do rinse it out and try to reuse it a couple of times, but eventually it needs to be discarded. And but the good thing about cheesecloth is it's very easy cleanup. So if you're very busy and you're in the point where you're raising children, I certainly understand that, and it's just a very busy household, and you want to just take it out and throw it out, that's fine. But in any event, if you want to go the flour sack route, I highly recommend it. It's a very affordable option. So what I do is I'm going to move the cheesecloth along as I strain this out, because the debris, you'll see, will build up a bit and it'll make it a little difficult to strain the broth. So I start at one end basically, put this in like this, and then once I get the broth in here, I'll strain it over like this. And so basically doing a double straining. One time through here, but the larger holes, that'll catch maybe a little bone or two that maybe I wasn't able to get with the ladle when I was removing, with the strainer when I was removing everything into the bowl over there. So I'm going to set this aside, and I'm first going to ladle the bone broth into here. Alrighty, well, I've just moved the crock of the bone broth to this side because I'm right-handed, so it's a little easier to work with. But basically what we're going to do is we're just going to ladle one ladleful at a time into this fat separator. And I'll show you when I get to the top, we'll put it down and we'll watch the fat rise to the top. Okay. And that'll raise to the top. It'll take a few seconds, but you might be able to see. I'm not sure if I disturb it, it might move. I don't know if you can see, there's just a little bit of chicken fat, or what we call schmaltz, rising to the top. Now, I often find that with chicken bone broth, I don't get a lot of fat. When I do this with and making beef bone broth, I'll see a good layer of beef tallow there. But with the chicken, it's very slight. I'm not even sure you can see it. It's, gosh, maybe an eighth of an inch. Okay, so we've got our first batch of chicken bone broth strained into the fat separator. And now I'm going to put the flour sack towel into the strainer over my bowl here. Now, one thing that I want to mention, if you're not using a fat separator like this, what I would do at this point is simply take my bone broth, strain it through the flour sack towel, through the strainer into my bowl. Then I would let this cool, the strained bone broth cool in the refrigerator. Then the next day, I'd just skim the chicken fat off the top, and then you'd be ready to decant it. Now, some people like leaving the fat on. You can certainly do that, and you can just decant it, strain it, decant it right away, and have that little layer of fat on it. Chicken fat is supposed to be very good for you. So That's certainly a personal option depending on the taste and what you're going to be using it for. Alrighty, so now I see that little line. It's almost imperceptible, but there is a little line. So I'm just going to do this right now. As you see, I'm going to show you once it gets down a little lower and I can show you the debris that I'm talking about that starts to build up. I'm just going to stop and I'm going to let this strain off. And this is why I start at one point of the flour sack towel as opposed to right in the middle, but I guess you could start in the middle. It's just force of habit, the system that I use. And I'll move it little by little as we start to strain, because some of the debris in it will make it more difficult as it builds up to strain through easily. So I just want to get this out there so that I can show you. So I think you can see. So these are some of the things that I'm straining out of it. And we're going to see more and more of that build up. And then as it builds up a little too much, then I'll move the towel. Alrighty, well, let's continue straining this. And once I get it all strained into my bowl here, I'll bring you back and we can get ready to decant it. Now, one more thing I wanted to show you before I continue straining this is I've strained all the broth out of here and I've got to that fat, chicken fat right at the bottom here. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to transfer this to a different container before I continue to strain out the rest of my broth. And I'm just going to put this aside in a little container like this, let all the fat drain out. And I'm going to put that aside. Then later on, I'm going to strain this fat, and what I'll be left with will be nice yellow chicken fat, otherwise known as schmaltz, which is a wonderful ingredient to use in various recipes, including making chopped chicken livers. Well, I've strained out all the bone broth from the slow cooker, and as you'll see, as I was straining some out with the ladle, there were a few little bones left that were caught by the fat, the strainer top of the fat separator, so that was a good thing. And then I strained the fat into this little bowl here, and as you see, there's actually a little bit of, you can see of the chicken fat better here, I think, now than you could in the fat separator with each individual batch. Now this is all the schmaltz up here. Now I'm going to restrain this. I'll get a little more broth out of this, and it'll also help clean up the fat a little. Then I'll decant the fat into a small container, which I'll keep in my refrigerator for other recipes. Well, now that I've strained all of the bone broth, I wanted to show you how the flour sack looks after it's caught the various debris coming off of the ladle as I strained it through here. But as you'll see, this is all the different little bits of chicken meat, skin, some disintegrated little bits of carrot, and as I said, I moved the cheesecloth along over the strainer to make it easier for the bone broth to drain through, because as you see there's a lot of little bits of debris that it does catch, and it helps clear out the broth really nicely so that it looks very clear and appetizing when you do go to decant it. So now that I have this, oh, this is all messy, but I just put it right here in my strainer, and I'm going to transfer this to my kitchen sink. I'm going to wash this out right in the sink, get all the debris off of it and whatnot, and then once that's all washed out, I'll add it into a load of wash with my dishcloths that I'm washing anyways. Now for this video, I used this large measuring cup to strain off the broth to make it easy to show you. But I had much more broth than I could just fit in here, and especially with the strainer, coming down to about this level. And so I was transferring it into a bowl. Normally I'd strain it into a stock pot. That way I just do it in one fell swoop. But for purposes of this, I wanted to be able to show you in something that was glass so that you could see exactly what I was doing. Alrighty, now that we've got all of this bone broth strained and it's looking beautiful, it smells wonderful, it's been defatted, so I'm ready to decant it. Now, if, as I mentioned earlier, you didn't use a fat separator and you do have the fat that's congealing on top, you can refrigerate it overnight and then remove the fat the next day. Or some people like to leave the fat in. They find it nutritious and pleasing to the mouth taste, so you can also leave it in. That's totally personal choice. Now, I like to decant my bone broth into these, I think they're called French jelly jars, because it holds just about 16 ounces and it also allows for a little bit of headspace, because I store this in my freezer and then that allows it, gives it a little headspace to expand. And the reason that I do this is I find that storing it in the freezer really helps retain the gelatinous nature of the broth. I don't can my bone broth, because I've heard from other canners who pressure can their bone broth that it often breaks the gelatin and the broth that they are left with is no longer gelatinous. However, it's still nutritious, but I prefer to keep it gelatinous. So I put mine in the freezer. Now, another option is, and I don't do this with chicken bone broth, but I do it with beef bone broth. Beef bone broth we drink every day for breakfast. Just plain, along with whatever else we have for breakfast. And I will just fill a half-gallon size jar with my beef bone broth. And I sometimes get anywhere from a jar and a half to maybe 2 jars of those large half-gallon mason jars. I put that in my refrigerator, and we drink that within a few days. So I generally don't freeze beef bone broth. I usually just continually make it, put it in the refrigerator, drink it. Chicken bone broth, on the other hand, I usually use for recipes as opposed to drinking as a beverage or as a broth soup. I usually make a soup with it, like chicken noodle soup or chicken and rice soup, something like that, and I also use it to make gravy. So what I like to do is this jar, as I said, up to this point right here where the ridge is, holds about 16 ounces. So that's 2 cups, and that's perfect for me when making soup or gravy or another recipe where I want to use about 2 cups of chicken bone broth. Now, I just want to say a note about these jars. Keep your eye open when you're out shopping at thrift stores. I have often found these at Goodwill, and they are less expensive than if you buy them at other places, other kitchen stores or on Amazon. They're usually quite reasonable at stores like Goodwill. And if you qualify for the senior discount, on Tuesdays they give 30% off. That's my favorite day to shop. You only have to be 55, I say only 55 or over to qualify for the 30% discount on Tuesday. I'm over 60, so I qualify for pretty much all the discounts now, pretty much everywhere. In any event, I just wanted to let you know that you can find these, and they're actually quite common. Now, as to the lids, I don't often find the lids at Goodwill. Often they're sold with the lid, at the kitchen stores, but they are a little more costly. But the lids are actually very affordable and easy to find online. I'll look for that, and I'll link to these lids below. Well, I'm going to go ahead and decant all of this into my jars, and when I'm all done, I'll bring you back and we can see how many jars of chicken, in this case roast chicken bone broth, we can get out of those chicken carcasses. Well, I managed to get 5 beautiful 16-ounce jars filled with this bone broth, this chicken bone broth. Now, I've got a little bit left in here, but I'm actually just going to save this and set this aside because I'm going to make a chicken noodle soup, and so I'll add that in with one of these jars when I get ready to make that, since that's just a little bit. And I don't want to go over this little, if you can see this little line, this little bump in these jars, because I like to give myself a good inch, so to speak, of headspace, because when I put these in the freezer, they are going to expand. Now, I have never had any problem with these jars cracking. I have not used mason jars for storing bone broth, so I don't know how those would work. But that may be something to look into. If any of you have tried freezing bone broth in a mason jar in the freezer, and I guess leaving a certain amount of headspace and all of that, I'd be interested in hearing down in the comments what your experience was. Alrighty, well, I am going to put the lids on these. I like this. Another thing too about these French jelly jars is if for any reason I did overfill them, all that happens in my freezer, the jar doesn't crack, it just boop, the top pops off, and that's it. It just pushes the top up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these lids on, and I'm going to get these into the freezer, and when I come back, I'm going to show you a bone broth that I've defrosted that is back at refrigerator temperature, so that you can see the level of gelatin that I tend to get in my bone broths. Well, I put the 4 jars of bone broth that I made in the freezer, and the 5th one I put over there on my cutting board along with the little bit of extra that I had, because I'm going to make a chicken soup with the leftovers from the roast chicken that I made. And when I make a chicken soup, I like to use about 8 cups of chicken broth, chicken bone broth, and then 8 cups of water. And so that is about 2 cups, and this will be about another 2 cups. Now this is from a batch that I had made previously that I took out of my freezer, and I let it defrost overnight in the refrigerator. Now it's been at room temperature for a good while, but I wanted to show you the consistency of what the bone broth looks like. This is beautifully gelatinous, as you can see. It was even a little more gelatinous before, but it's coming up to room temp quite a bit. It's warm in my kitchen. I live in Central Texas, and this is the month of June, so it's well into the high 90s out there. So it's pretty warm in here. But as you can see, it's got a lovely, very, very gelatinous consistency. And when it first comes out of the refrigerator, it actually almost looks like Jell-O. But this is wonderful. It just came beautiful, and it's wonderfully nutritious. For complete instructions on how to make this roast chicken bone broth that we made here in my kitchen today, please visit my website, marysnest.com. And if you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and be sure to hit the notification bell, which will let you know every time I upload a video. Well, that's all for today, but I want to thank you so much for joining me here in my kitchen and cooking with me, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Love, and God bless.